Hey everyone, I'm Maria and this is Spill the Sauce, a Sunday Table podcast. I want to start by saying that me being right here and recording this feels surreal to say out loud, because this podcast has been sitting with me for a while now, a lot longer than I probably realized. Sunday felt like the right day to begin, not because it's perfect, but because it's familiar, because Sunday has always been about the gathering, whether that gathering was loud, messy, emotional, or quiet. This podcast, it's meant to feel like a table, not a stage, not a performance, just a place to sit for a while. You're listening to Spill the Sauce, a Sunday Table podcast, like Sunday dinner, messy, funny, heartfelt, and un po' pazza. I'm Maria. Pull up a chair. So, growing up, Sunday dinner was never just dinner for us, It wasn't optional, it wasn't quick, and it definitely wasn't quiet. Sunday meant food. A whole ton of it. It meant people talking over each other, opinions being shared, whether you asked for them or not, because, a Zia or a Nonna or even one of your older cousins always had an opinion. And of course, you always had someone insisting you didn't have enough to eat. And madon, especially if you were already full. And then there were the rules, even if no one's ever said them out loud. And they were basic. They were basic rules. Everyone knew them. You showed up, you sat down, you ate, and you stayed. The food on that table was how love showed up. We didn't say, I missed you. We said, did you eat? We didn't say, I've been worried about you. We just put more on that plate. And it was all the funny moments, the dramatics, the arguments that somehow still ended with dessert. And the ways the stories just got bigger every time they were retold. Sunday dinner had its own rhythm, and whether you wanted to or not, you learned it. And, sometimes what I find really, really funny is that at the time, as a young kid, as a young adult, it didn't feel special. None of it did. It felt normal. It was what we did every Sunday. And you don't realize that you're living inside of a memory. We're living inside a living memory while it's actually happening. We realize that later. When the table is quieter, smaller, maybe gone. What I didn't know back then is that those Sundays were teaching me how to belong, how to stay, and how to show love without always having the words for it. I think a lot of us, grow up thinking that food is just food. And then one day we realize, holy crap, it was language. It was reassurance. And it was care disguised as routine. You knew exactly who was coming and at what time. It took me a long time to understand that food was never really the point. That table was. The table where you learned who your people were, who talked the most, who listened the best, who showed love quietly, who showed it loudly. Because there was always one aunt or cousin who was the loudest of them all. And it was that table where absence showed up. The empty chair that changes the whole room. And even if no one says anything, you know that everyone is feeling it. And what I realized today that I didn't know back then was how much of myself was being shaped at that Sunday table. how memory, identity, grief, humor, and the connection were all tangled together in those moments. The laughter lived right next to the sadness. Joy lived right next to the longing. And today, that's something that I still carry with me. When Mom passed away 2 years ago, I didn't realize how much of my life would change. And I also didn't understand how much the table would change over time. How grief rearranges the space. There are seats that stay empty, voices you still expect to hear, and recipes or dishes that suddenly feel heavier than they used to. And learning to find the answers to your kids asking, what about Nona's sauce on Sunday? And no one really prepares you for that, for how the memory lives in ordinary things. And, when you think back to those empty seats and those quiet voices that only in your head exist today, sometimes those seats get filled up again. Maybe by your, a new relative joining the family, a new cousin being born, and a new niece, a new nephew. Those seats can get filled up again. And I think that's part of why these stories matter to me now, today. Because they remind me that love doesn't disappear. It just changes form. And if you've been following me for a while, you know that for a long time, these stories just kept showing up in my writing. And I do write a lot about memory and traditions and heritage and culture. And I guess without even knowing, it was all of the things that I learned at that Sunday table, at those gatherings, when La Familia was all together. And even when I was blogging, and creating a recipe or using a recipe where I just plainly thought I was writing about food, what I was really writing about was love or grief or even belonging. And at some point over time, writing didn't feel like it was enough anymore. And these stories needed voice. They needed pauses. They needed breath. And I didn't want a podcast that just tells people what to do or how to live or how to fix anything. I wanted a space that felt slower, more human, less performative. I wanted to share stories about our Italian culture, our heritage, our language. I wanted to share stories about being Italian in America, being Italian American in America, and how we identify, So this isn't a how-to podcast. It's not about being right. It's not about having any answers. It's about being present. I hesitated for a long time before making this podcast. I believe that hitting record was one of the biggest decisions I've made in a very long time. And I kept asking myself if these stories were enough, if they mattered, if they were too small, too personal, too quiet, too big. And then I realized that the hesitation that I felt is the whole point. We don't talk enough about the ordinary moments that shape us, the ones that go viral, the ones that don't go viral, the ones that just stay. So this podcast is my way of honoring those moments. not by explaining them, but by sitting with them and with you. And I just want to make a couple of things clear, because everyone's going to be like, well, then what the heck is this podcast about? What, you're just going to tell stories? Well, all stories come with a moral, right? Like, you look at Aesop's fables, and you look at your favorite, childhood books. They all teach us how to act in a society. And so many of us, we have this identity of, well, I was born in Italy, or I was born in America, but my parents are 100% Italian. And so we have this identity issue within our culture, in America. And there's so much more behind it. So, some weeks this podcast will be light and funny. Some weeks it might be a little bit quieter. And some weeks it may hit emotionally in ways that even I may not always expect. But what it will always be, or at least always try to be, is honest. And don't expect a perfect podcast, or a polished one, or trendy. This space is for those stories, the kind that don't always fit neatly into categories. But to us, it still matters. And, maybe I'll share a recipe from Molfetta, from the Puglia region. Maybe I'll have one of my half Sicilian cousins come on the show and, talk about how their ragu is different than my mom's ragu. How their baked ziti is different than my baked ziti. Maybe how we are both first generations and still identify differently. Maybe I'll have my husband and what it's like to be married to an Italian girl. There's going to be so many different things that we talk about and stories to share. So each week will be different, and sometimes for other content creators and other influencers and bloggers, we'll probably have a special episode on why storytelling is important more than algorithms. Because that's not what I want this to be. I don't want it to be about algorithms. Sure, yes, I invite you to stay. I invite you to listen. I invite you to follow me. Email me. Whatever you want to do. I want you here. But I also want people to understand that the stories that we share together are all a part of who we are. And understanding who we are, where we come from, where our ancestors come from, whether you're first, second, third, fourth, fifth generation Italian American, why it all still matters today. The Italian diaspora is big because it's not just in America, right? There's a big population in Australia. There's a big population in Venezuela. There's a big population in Argentina. Heck, there's a huge population in Scotland. Did you guys know that? My husband's family is Scots Italian. He was able to trace that back. So it's really, really cool how, Italian migration shaped so much of what we know today. And I want to share all of these stories, the hardships and the identity and the heritage and the culture. I want to share all of that because I believe that it's important. And not only is it important, but I truly feel that every family has their own tradition, their own way of doing things, their own words. There's a story, a memory actually, that I keep coming back to, and I kind of touched on it earlier about when my mom passed, and, the kids in the family were like, well, what about Nona's sauce? Nona's meatballs? There were dishes that my mom made for everyone in the family. Specifically, she made potato croquettes with ham and mozzarella for my husband. She would make beef ribs specifically for my sister's stepdaughter. She made zucchini fritters and shrimp fritters for me and my sister. Meatballs for the boys, and she called them the boys' balls. So when she passed, everyone was worried about how are we going to continue? How are we going to continue her tradition? And somehow, by memory, I've realized that I have all of my mother's recipes and techniques memorized. How I went from being her potato peeler, because, in air quotes, I was just so good at it, to becoming her onion chopper because my eyes don't tear. I went to being able to recreate her polpetti, her pasta al forno, le frittelle, la lasagna, utrid, which is homemade pastina. I have all of her delicious lesson learning recipes completely memorized. And so I think that's what I mean by the changes and traditions and the memories that live on and how they shape us. Because it truly is inspiring to know that you can carry on someone's legacy and share in their memories even after they have gone. In a way, it's how I still feel close to her. So on days when I'm feeling a little extra nostalgic or sad, or I'm missing her terribly, or something has gone wrong, I go to my kitchen and I start baking, or I start making pasta, or I start making one of her recipes that brought comfort, like her lenticchie and pasta, or her, polpettone on a weekday. And oh my God, there's a Facebook post, and it comes up in my memories every now and then. Well, every year, really. And I used to call it the monster meatloaf. My mom would, it was a stuffed meatloaf. I mean, this thing was at least 2 feet long, if not longer. And it had the prosciutto cotto, mozzarella, and boiled eggs, hard-boiled eggs in it. And when you cut that thing open, it was beautiful to look at and even more delicious to eat. And she would make it with un poco di salsa di pomodoro on top and potatoes on the side. Like, she would roast the potatoes with the meatloaf, so the potatoes got all of the flavor from the meatloaf itself. And it's those things, those little tiny snippets of flashbacks, of memories, that have truly kept our family together over the past few years since mom past. And these are the stories and the memories that I want to share with you guys. Because we all have that, right? We all have that nostalgia. Like, oh, I remember when, you know, my nonna did this, or my mama did that, or my papa made this. And I think it's important that we continue to share those, and that there's a space that exists for these stories, for these memories. Now I'm hungry. No, I'm kidding. I'm not really hungry. It's early still, and I'm terrified of publishing this live for you guys. But I think those memories are so important to carry on in our families. And another thing that I remember, and yes, it has to do with my mom, so don't roll your eyes. It was the day before her funeral, and we had family coming in from New Jersey to Ohio. And I wasn't going to have my family go to restaurants or get fast food or something like that. I did what my mom would have done, and I cooked. I made a big stock pot of salsa bolognese, and I made fettuccine for the pasta. And I think it was maybe 15 of us. We were a lot. And as I was making the plates, I made an extra one. And I placed it at my mom's spot. This was all done unintentionally, subconsciously. And everyone got quiet. The entire kitchen just went from super loud, everyone talking over each other, laughing or crying, as my sister and I were, but to complete silence, like radio silence. And I turned around to see what happened. And they just looked at me. And then I looked at the table and I realized what I had done. And I think that's what I mean when I say the space changes, the table changes, but the memory just continues to live on, Everything just feels different. You can feel the changes. But their memory, their traditions become yours, become your memories. They become your traditions. They become your legacy. And I truly feel that it's up to us to carry those on by telling our stories. Language is such a big part of the Italian culture, and especially the Italian American culture. And sure, I poke fun every now and then. And I'll post, like I did last week about the ricotta. And I'll post like I did just a few days ago about the calamari. Because trust me, there is nothing that irks me more than hearing galamad. I just can't. But in the same breath, I understand dialects. I understand assimilation. And translation from Italian to American, from dialect to English is difficult. And sometimes there are no words for what we know of every day. Look at what I posted on Saturday about the sauce versus gravy. So there is so much to talk about, to discover together. And so if any part of what I've been saying, if any part of this felt familiar, If you've ever sat at a table like that or wished you could again, you're welcome here. I want to thank you for spending this time with me. I know this time is personal and it means something that you chose to be here. And if this episode resonated with you, I really hope you come back next week. Thanks for spending some time at the table with me. If this episode felt like home, I'll see you next Sunday. I saved you a seat.